No one in the hospital questioned it when they saw her asleep at the nurse's station. To them, she was just a careless nurse who couldn't handle the pressure of the night shift. Within hours, she was fired, labelled as unprofessional, irresponsible, and unfit for the job. But what no one knew was the truth behind that moment. For 36 straight hours, she had been alone in a collapsing ICU, fighting to keep a patient alive while systems failed, staff were missing, and no help arrived. And while the hospital blamed her for sleeping, the cameras had already recorded everything they tried to ignore. The hospital corridor was unusually quiet that night, the kind of silence that felt heavy rather than peaceful. Fluorescent lights hummed above the polished floors of St. Malo General Hospital, casting a cold glow over exhausted staff moving between wards. At the central nurse station, a young nurse named Emily Carter sat slumped forward in her chair. Emily was 26 years old, slim-built, with tired eyes framed by dark lashes that had long lost their freshness. Her brown hair, usually tied neatly into a bun, had loosened into messy strands falling over her face. She had the kind of presence that once radiated warmth, calm, attentive, and deeply empathetic, but long months of understaffed shifts had replaced that softness with exhaustion. She was not careless, not irresponsible. She was simply beyond her limits. Her pen slipped from her fingers and hit the desk softly. For a few seconds, her breathing slowed. Then she drifted into sleep without even realizing it. A few meters away, footsteps approached. Nurse supervisor Linda Hayes, a woman in her late 40s with sharp cheekbones, tightly pulled blonde hair, and a rigid posture that never softened, stopped abruptly. Linda was known throughout the hospital for her strict discipline and zero tolerance for mistakes. Years of working under pressure had hardened her into someone who valued rules above context. Her eyes locked onto Emily immediately. "Unbelievable," Linda muttered under her breath. Without hesitation, she pulled out her phone and snapped a photo. At the same time, on the upper floor, Dr. Daniel Reed was reviewing patient charts. Daniel was 31, tall and lean, with short dark hair and a calm but intense gaze. Unlike many senior doctors hardened by routine, Daniel still carried traces of emotional awareness. He had once lost a patient early in his career due to delayed response in a similar understaffed situation, and that memory had permanently shaped his sensitivity toward hospital system failures. As he walked past the ICU corridor, he noticed unusual activity. Monitors beeped faster than normal. A nurse rushed past him without stopping. Something was wrong. Back at the nurse station, Linda stood over Emily, arms crossed. "Sleeping on duty," she said coldly. "Do you have any idea what kind of hospital this is?" Emily slowly stirred awake, blinking in confusion. Her face showed no defensiveness, only exhaustion so deep it made her movements slow and unsteady. I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't realize You didn't realize?" Linda interrupted sharply. "Patients depend on you staying alert." Emily tried to explain, but her voice was weak. Her body felt heavy, as if even standing required effort. Before she could finish, Linda turned away. "I'll report this immediately." In ICU room 3, alarms suddenly went off. A patient's condition was deteriorating rapidly. Mr. Harold Simmons, a 67-year-old man with severe cardiac complications, lay unconscious on the bed. His skin was pale, oxygen levels dropping quickly. Machines beeped urgently as his heart rhythm became unstable. Daniel rushed in immediately. "What happened here?" he asked. A junior nurse, barely 23, pale-faced and overwhelmed, shook her head. We tried calling for assistance, but no one came fast enough." Daniel's jaw tightened. He glanced toward the schedule board outside the ICU. Short-staffed again. always short-staffed. Meanwhile, Emily, still disoriented, stood up at the nurse station. Her legs wobbled slightly as she tried to regain focus. Linda passed her without another word, already typing the incident report. Emily looked toward the ICU corridor, hearing the alarms faintly echoing. She didn't know it yet, but that night was about to define her entire life. And the truth of what really happened during those lost hours was already being written, by machines, by records, and by a system that never saw the full picture. The morning after the incident felt colder than usual inside St. Malo General Hospital. News travelled fast in places like this. By 8 a.m., Emily Carter's name had already moved through multiple departments, not as a hard-working nurse, but as the one who slept during duty. In the administration office on the top floor, Hospital Director Margaret Collins reviewed the incident report. Margaret was a woman in her early 50s, tall and sharply dressed in a grey tailored suit. Her silver-streaked hair was pulled into a tight knot, and her expression rarely showed emotion. Years of managing crises had shaped her belief that hospitals must appear flawless, even when they were not. "This is unacceptable," she said flatly. Across from her stood Linda Hayes, the nurse supervisor from the night shift. Linda's posture was rigid, her voice confident. "She was asleep at the station during ICU hours," Linda repeated. "That alone is grounds for disciplinary action." Margaret didn't ask what had led to it. Not at first. Instead, she looked at the summary line. "Staff negligence during critical monitoring period." "No excuses," Margaret said. "Issue a formal warning. If there's any repetition, termination will follow." No one mentioned workload. No one mentioned staffing shortages. No one mentioned the 36-hour shifts quietly embedded in the schedule system. Downstairs, Emily stood in the staff locker room, staring at her reflection. Her face looked even more exhausted under the harsh lighting. Dark circles under her eyes were now clearly visible. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her uniform. She had not slept properly in 2 days. She had not eaten a full meal in 1. But none of that appeared in the report. In the ICU corridor, Dr. Daniel Reed reviewed patient logs with growing concern. Daniel, tall and composed, with a calm but analytical gaze, noticed something off immediately. He turned to a junior nurse nearby. Why was room 3 left without backup support for nearly 40 minutes? The nurse hesitated. She was young, barely 23, with short hair tied loosely and an anxious expression. "We didn't have enough staff assigned," she admitted quietly. "That's not possible," Daniel said. "The schedule shows 3 nurses assigned." The nurse lowered her eyes. "One called in sick, another was reassigned. I think administration changed it last minute." Daniel frowned. That didn't make sense. Or rather, it made too much sense in a dangerous way. Meanwhile, in the scheduling office, Senior Nurse Coordinator Bethany Ruiz worked quickly on her computer. Bethany was in her late 30s, petite, with sharp eyes and a nervous habit of tapping her fingers whenever stressed. Unlike Margaret, she understood the system from the inside, and that meant she understood how fragile it was. She hesitated before opening a confidential file. The ICU shift allocation logs. A small change had been made overnight, not officially documented, not approved. She stared at it for a long time, then quietly closed the file. Some problems, she knew, were safer not to question. Back in the meeting room, Margaret finalized the decision. Emily Carter will receive formal disciplinary notice. Document it. File it. Linda nodded immediately. No one asked for Emily's side of the story. No one reviewed her hours. No one checked ICU activity logs. It was simpler this way. Cleaner. At the same time, Daniel stood alone near the ICU window, watching monitors flicker inside the ward. Something about this didn't feel like a mistake. It felt like a pattern. And patterns, in hospitals, were never accidental. The tension inside St. Malo General Hospital shifted sharply that afternoon. What had begun as a disciplinary issue was about to turn into something far more serious. In ICU Room 3, Mr. Harold Simmons, the 67-year-old cardiac patient, suddenly went into acute distress. His heart rhythm destabilized again, but this time the drop was faster, more violent. Monitors screamed, alarms echoed through the sterile white walls. Emily Carter was already nearby. She had not been reassigned. She had not been relieved. After receiving her formal warning earlier that day, she had quietly returned to her duties without protest. Emily, 26, exhausted with hollow eyes and trembling hands, rushed into the ICU room. Her uniform was slightly wrinkled, her hair loosely tied back. Despite everything, her movements were precise, automatic, trained by repetition under pressure. "Prepare epinephrine," she called out. A junior nurse hesitated at the crash cart. The machine beside the patient beeped erratically, then stopped responding correctly. The cardiac monitor malfunctioned, displaying unstable readings that did not match the patient's actual condition. Emily froze for half a second. Not because she didn't know what to do, but because she now had to trust instinct over data. In the corridor, Dr. Daniel Reed arrived almost immediately. Daniel, 31, tall with a lean frame and focused eyes, had already been monitoring ICU trends after noticing irregular staffing reports. "What happened?" he asked sharply. "The monitor is glitching," one nurse replied. "We're not getting accurate vitals." Daniel stepped closer, checking the system. "That's not just a glitch," he muttered. "That's system lag in critical output." He turned to Emily. She didn't wait for instructions. She was already acting. Inside the ICU room, time felt compressed. Emily performed emergency procedures step by step, her voice steady despite exhaustion. "Manual pulse check. Now." A nurse nearby whispered, "She's been working since last night." Daniel looked at her briefly, but said nothing. There was no time for judgment now, only survival. Elsewhere in the hospital system room, tech specialist Aaron Blake, a man in his late 20s with messy brown hair, glasses slightly crooked from fatigue, stared at the ICU system dashboard in confusion. Aaron was responsible for medical device integration and had always been quiet, analytical, and overly cautious. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered. "The ICU alert system should auto-reroute backup nurses." He checked the logs. The reroute function had been disabled, manually. His expression tightened. "That's not a failure," he whispered. "That's a shutdown." Back in ICU, Emily continued working non-stop. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. No backup nurse arrived. No relief came. The call system had been triggered multiple times, but responses were delayed or ignored. Daniel looked toward the hallway. "This unit is supposed to have 3 active nurses," he said quietly. There was no answer, only silence. Outside the ICU doors, senior nurse coordinator Bethany Ruiz stood frozen, watching the situation unfold from the corridor monitor panel. Bethany, petite with nervous eyes and constant tension in her fingers, saw the staffing mismatch clearly. She had access to the override logs. She knew what had been changed. But she also knew something else. If she reported it, the blame chain would lead somewhere dangerous. So she stayed silent. Inside the ICU, Emily's movements slowed slightly, but she refused to stop. Her breathing became heavier. Her hands trembled, but continued working. Daniel finally stepped in beside her. "You need backup," he said firmly. Emily shook her head slightly. "There is no backup," she replied. That was the truth no report had recorded. For the first time that day, Daniel understood something deeply wrong was happening, not with Emily, but with the system itself. And systems, when they failed silently, were the most dangerous kind. The ICU crisis did not end quickly. It stretched through the night, and into the next day, and then into another night again. Emily Carter had already lost track of time. At some point, the hospital stopped feeling like a place. It became a cycle: alarms, medication, monitoring, manual intervention, repeat. Emily, 26, slim and visibly exhausted, moved through the ICU like a shadow of herself. Her once neat uniform was now slightly wrinkled, her hair loosely tied and falling apart. Her face was pale, but her eyes, though heavy, refused to close. She was no longer working. She was surviving inside the work. The patient, Mr. Harold Simmons, remained in critical condition. His heart rhythm fluctuated unpredictably. Every stabilization was temporary, every improvement fragile. Emily stood beside the bed, adjusting the IV flow with shaking hands. "Stay with us," she whispered, not to the system, but to the patient. A junior nurse nearby looked overwhelmed. "You've been here since yesterday," the nurse said softly. Emily didn't respond immediately. She simply checked the monitor again. "I can't leave yet," she said. In the ICU control corridor, Dr. Daniel Reed had not left either. Daniel, 31, tall, lean, with tired but focused eyes, stood in front of a digital monitor wall. He had begun pulling internal logs manually after noticing inconsistencies in staffing records. Beside him was technician Ryan Miller, a 29-year-old IT support staff member with short, curly hair, slightly disheveled appearance, and a nervous but honest personality. Ryan was not built for confrontation. He was the type who followed systems until systems stopped making sense. "This is not normal," Ryan said, scrolling through data. "She's been logged as continuously active for over 30 hours. Daniel looked at him. "That's impossible." Ryan shook his head. "The system says otherwise." That was the problem. The system was telling the truth, but no one wanted to believe it. Back in ICU room 3, Emily continued working. Her movements had slowed slightly, not due to hesitation, but due to physical collapse creeping in. She leaned against the edge of the bed for half a second, then straightened again. No one replaced her. No one relieved her. There was no one available. Above the ICU ceiling, security cameras quietly recorded everything. Not the panic, not the noise, just continuous footage of one nurse holding an entire critical unit together alone. The recording system stored it all without interpretation. No context, no emotion, just time-stamped reality. Daniel finally stopped reviewing logs. He turned to Ryan. "Export everything from this shift," he said. Ryan hesitated. "If administration sees this—" "I don't care," Daniel interrupted. "Something is wrong here and I need proof." Ryan nodded slowly and began copying the data onto a secure drive. For the first time, he wasn't just following instructions. He was documenting something that felt wrong. Meanwhile, Bethany Ruiz, the senior nurse coordinator, watched from a distance. Petite, tense, with anxious fingers constantly tapping her badge, she had access to the staffing system override history. She saw the truth clearly. Emily was never supposed to be alone this long. The system had reassigned help that never arrived. But Bethany did nothing. Not because she didn't care, but because every correction would expose a deeper failure buried above her level. Back in ICU room 3, Emily finally staggered slightly. Her vision blurred for a moment. Daniel immediately stepped forward. "You need to step out for 5 minutes," he said firmly. Emily shook her head. "If I step out, he won't stabilize." That was not protocol speaking. That was experience speaking. And Daniel understood something important in that moment. This was no longer about one patient. It was about a system that only functioned because one exhausted nurse refused to stop. The hospital boardroom was cold, sterile, and completely detached from the chaos that had unfolded just floors below. Inside, decisions were made with clean words, printed reports, and carefully structured sentences that removed all human weight from the situation. Emily Carter was not present. She had no voice in the room where her future was being decided. At the centre of the meeting sat hospital director Margaret Collins, a woman in her early 50s with silver-streaked hair pulled tightly into a bun and an expression that never softened. She believed discipline was the backbone of healthcare institutions. Anything less meant collapse. Beside her stood Linda Hayes, the nurse supervisor, rigid and confident, still convinced her judgment from the night shift was correct. "We cannot ignore a breach like this," Linda said firmly. "Sleeping during ICU hours is unacceptable under any circumstance." Margaret reviewed the final report in silence. No mention of staffing shortages, no mention of system failure, no mention of 36-hour workload accumulation. Only one line stood out. "Nurse found asleep during critical monitoring period." "That is sufficient," Margaret said at last. "Terminate employment effective immediately." No hesitation, no investigation, no second review. Just closure. At the same time, in the hospital's administrative records office, Human Resources Officer Carla Nguyen, a woman in her late 30s with neatly tied black hair and a cautious, detail-oriented demeanour, was quietly reviewing shift documentation. Unlike the boardroom, Carla saw the raw scheduling data, and what she saw did not match the official narrative. Emily Carter's shifts had been repeatedly extended. Back-to-back ICU assignments, missing relief entries. But certain entries had been edited, manually adjusted after the fact. Carla hesitated. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She knew this was wrong, but she also knew who had approved the final report. So she closed the file and said nothing. Down in ICU, Emily was still there, still working, still holding the system together with exhausted hands. She had not been informed yet, not officially, but she could feel something shifting. The atmosphere felt different, colder. Dr. Daniel Reed, standing outside ICU Room 3, received a notification on his tablet. "Employment status update. Emily Carter, terminated." He froze. Daniel, tall, lean, with sharp but increasingly concerned eyes, looked up immediately towards the boardroom level. "That's it," he muttered. Beside him, technician Ryan Miller, 29, slightly messy hair, anxious expression but strong moral instincts, leaned over. "They didn't even review the ICU footage yet," Ryan said quietly. Daniel clenched his jaw. "That means they're not looking for truth," he replied. "They're looking for closure." In the ICU family waiting area, Mrs. Laura Simmons, the patient's daughter, sat unaware of everything unfolding above. She was in her mid-40s, neatly dressed, with tired but hopeful eyes. She had been told her father was stable under observation. No one had told her that stability was held together by one exhausted nurse who was just fired. She checked her phone again. Still no updates. Back in administration, Margaret signed the final document. "Case closed," she said. Linda nodded, but neither of them noticed the silent data logs continuing to compile in the background. Camera footage, system overrides, shift discrepancies. Everything still recording. Everything still remembering. In ICU Room 3, Emily finally looked up at the corridor screen. A notification flashed briefly. Her name. Status. Terminated. She stared at it for a long moment. Not shocked, not angry, just still. Because in that moment, she finally realized. No one had ever asked what happened during those 36 hours. and somewhere in the system logs, the truth was still waiting to be seen. The termination notice had already been signed. But the truth inside St. Malo General Hospital was far from finished. It was only beginning to surface. In a small monitoring room above the ICU corridor, Dr. Daniel Reed sat in front of a surveillance terminal. Daniel, 31, tall, lean, with sharp analytical eyes and a calm but increasingly disturbed expression, had stopped trusting reports. He now trusted only raw data. Beside him was technician Ryan Miller, 29, slightly messy hair, anxious but honest demeanor, hands moving carefully over the keyboard. Ryan had always followed hospital protocols, but for the first time, he was questioning them. "You're sure you want to go through ICU footage manually?" Ryan asked. Daniel didn't look away from the screen. "I need to know what actually happened." They accessed the archived camera logs from ICU room 3. At first, nothing unusual appeared. Standard shifts, standard movement. But then the timeline extended beyond what the official schedule showed. Emily Carter appeared on screen, still in uniform, still working. Hours passed in accelerated playback. She moved between patients, monitors, medication stations, never stopping long enough to sit, never leaving the ICU zone. Ryan frowned. "That can't be right." Daniel leaned forward. "Keep going." The footage continued. 6 hours, 12 hours, 18 hours. Emily was still there. No relief nurse entered the room. No official replacement arrived. Only her. Always her. In a separate administrative wing, Senior Nurse Coordinator Bethany Ruiz stood frozen in front of the staffing system dashboard. Bethany, petite with tense posture and nervous finger movements, had discovered something she could no longer ignore. The ICU schedule had been altered manually, but the system logs showed something worse. The changes were made after the shifts had already started. Someone had rewritten reality after the fact. Back in the surveillance room, Daniel paused the footage. "She was alone," he said quietly. Ryan swallowed. "That's not possible under hospital policy." Daniel turned slightly. Then the policy was broken. Further investigation led them to deeper system logs. That's when they found it. A name linked to the ICU scheduling override. Dr. Gregory Shaw, a senior physician in charge of emergency coordination, known for his strict reputation and absolute authority over staffing decisions. In a private office on the executive floor, Dr. Gregory Shaw, a man in his late 50s with sharp grey hair, cold eyes, and an arrogant sense of control, was deleting system logs in real time. He believed in order above all else, even if that order required rewriting inconvenient truths. A junior IT assistant stood beside him nervously. "Sir, the ICU footage is still accessible elsewhere," the assistant said. Gregory didn't look up. "Then it shouldn't be." Back in the monitoring room, Daniel noticed something critical. The camera system had been accessed multiple times during Emily's shift. Not by her, but by administrative-level credentials. "Someone tried to erase parts of this," Daniel said. Ryan nodded slowly. "But they didn't succeed fully." Daniel looked at him. "No," he said, "because someone kept the system alive long enough for it to be recorded." That someone was Emily. Even while exhausted, even while alone, she had unknowingly preserved the evidence of her own suffering. Meanwhile, in the ICU waiting area, Mrs. Laura Simmons still sat unaware, holding her phone tightly. She had just been told her father was stable, but stability, as it turned out, had been maintained by someone who had already been erased from the system. Daniel leaned back slightly, eyes narrowing. "This isn't negligence," he said. "This is a cover-up." Ryan didn't respond immediately. because now he understood the truth. Emily hadn't failed the system. The system had failed her. The silence inside St. Malo General Hospital did not last long. Once the ICU footage began circulating internally, the atmosphere shifted from quiet denial to controlled panic. Rumours spread faster than official statements could contain them, and soon the situation could no longer be kept inside the building. In the hospital conference wing, Mrs. Laura Simmons, the daughter of the ICU patient, stood with shaking hands. She was in her mid-40s, elegantly dressed but visibly exhausted, her face pale from days of uncertainty. Her calm exterior was breaking as she demanded answers. "My father was told he was stable," she said sharply, "but no one can explain what actually happened." Beside her stood a legal representative, preparing formal documentation for an independent investigation. The hospital had no choice anymore. The case was escalating beyond internal control. At the same time, Dr. Daniel Reed stepped forward as an official witness. Daniel, 31, tall, composed, with sharp eyes now hardened by what he had seen, presented the ICU footage to the investigation committee. His tone was calm but firm. "She did not leave the ICU," he said, "not once during the critical period." The room fell silent. No one challenged the footage. Not anymore. In a separate administrative office, Hospital Director Margaret Collins, a woman in her early 50s with strict posture and controlled expression, watched the investigation unfold on a secured monitor feed. For the first time in her career, control was slipping away. Beside her, Linda Hayes, the nurse supervisor with rigid confidence, looked uneasy. Her earlier certainty no longer matched the evidence being presented. "That footage must have been misinterpreted," Linda insisted weakly. No one responded, because the data spoke louder than her voice. Meanwhile, inside the hospital IT division, technician Ryan Miller continued compiling system logs. Ryan, 29, slightly messy hair, anxious but increasingly determined, had moved from passive observer to active whistleblower. "I've traced every shift adjustment," he said quietly to Daniel. "It wasn't random. Someone systematically removed backup nurses from ICU schedules." Daniel looked at him. "Can you prove it?" Ryan nodded. "I already have." But not everyone supported the investigation. Within the hospital staff, a division had formed. One side believed Emily Carter had been unfairly treated. The other believed the hospital's decision was justified to protect its reputation. Whispers spread through corridors, break rooms, and nursing stations. "She fell asleep on duty." "No, she saved a patient alone for 36 hours." "No nurse can do that." "Yes, but she did." In the background, resistance was forming. Dr. Gregory Shaw, the senior physician responsible for ICU coordination, was now actively monitoring the investigation progress. Gregory, late 50s, cold eyes, controlled voice, had begun quietly instructing IT staff to restrict access to older system logs. "We don't need unnecessary confusion," he said. But his definition of confusion was rapidly becoming truth. Back in the investigation room, Daniel played the final segment of the ICU footage. Emily, exhausted beyond recognition, still moving, still refusing to stop. A board member leaned forward. "This nurse held an entire ICU alone?" he asked in disbelief. Daniel answered without hesitation. "Yes." For the first time, the narrative inside the hospital began to fracture completely. Emily Carter was no longer just a fired employee. She had become the center of a system-wide contradiction. And contradictions, once exposed, never stayed contained. The final hearing room was packed beyond capacity. Not because it was routine, but because it had become a public reckoning. News outlets, legal representatives, hospital executives, and staff all gathered under one roof. The truth about St. Malo General Hospital could no longer be contained behind closed doors. At the center of it all stood Emily Carter. Emily, 26, once exhausted beyond recognition, now appeared calmer, but still visibly worn. Her face carried the marks of what she had endured: sleepless nights, emotional strain, and a system that had nearly broken her. Her posture was steady, but her eyes still reflected disbelief at everything that had happened. She did not speak yet. She didn't need to. The evidence would speak for her. On the large screen in the hearing room, ICU footage played in full clarity. 36 hours of continuous work. No relief shifts, no backup nurses. Just Emily, moving between patients, responding to alarms, stabilizing a collapsing system alone. Then came the system logs, shift manipulation records, manual overrides, deleted scheduling entries. A clear pattern emerged. Not negligence, not incompetence, but systemic failure disguised as misconduct. Dr. Daniel Reed, standing beside the presentation desk, spoke with calm authority. Daniel, 31, tall, composed, with focused but softened eyes, had transitioned from observer to key witness. "She was not absent," he said. "She was abandoned by the system." No one interrupted him, because no one could. In the audience, technician Ryan Miller, 29, slightly dishevelled with tired but determined eyes, watched the confirmation of every file he had helped recover. He had started as a cautious IT support staff, but now he was a critical whistleblower. "This isn't just one mistake," Ryan said quietly to himself. "It was built into the system." Across the room, hospital director Margaret Collins, once confident and unshakable, sat in silence. For the first time in her career, authority had no effect here. Beside her, Linda Hayes looked pale, unable to maintain her earlier certainty. The narrative had fully collapsed. Then came the official statement. A senior board member stepped forward. "After reviewing all digital logs, surveillance footage and staffing records," he said, "we confirm that nurse Emily Carter was wrongly terminated." A pause. Then the final verdict. "The termination is revoked. Full reinstatement is granted." A second announcement followed. "We issue a formal public apology for the misjudgment and systemic failure that led to this incident." For a moment, the room remained still. Then whispers spread. Then silence again. Then understanding. Emily finally exhaled. Not in relief, but in release. Because for the first time, someone had believed the evidence instead of the assumption. Later that day, in a smaller internal meeting, Emily was officially offered reinstatement. But more than that, "The board would like to propose you for head nurse position," Margaret Collins said quietly. Her tone was no longer commanding. It was respectful. Daniel stood beside Emily afterward in the hallway. "You didn't just survive this," he said. "You exposed a system failure." Emily looked at him. "I didn't do it alone," she replied softly. Her eyes briefly shifted towards Ryan, who gave a small nod. In the weeks that followed, major reforms were implemented. Staffing systems were redesigned. Automatic shift verification was introduced. Emergency backup protocols were rebuilt. And for the first time, the hospital began prioritizing human workload over administrative perfection. But the most important change was not structural. It was awareness. Because now everyone understood one simple truth. If one exhausted nurse could hold an ICU together for 36 hours, then the system had failed long before she ever did. This story is over, but the question is not. If you were Emily, would you still forgive the hospital after everything they did? Or would you walk away and never come back? If you were Daniel, would you keep exposing the truth even if it destroyed your career? Or would you stay silent to protect your future? And if you were the hospital board, would you admit the truth immediately, or try to cover it up to protect the institution? There is no perfect answer, only choices that define who we are when no one is watching. Comment below, what would you do in this situation? Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more intense, emotional, and shocking real lifestyle stories like this. New stories are coming soon. You won't want to miss them.